All right, everyone, welcome to an Apocalypsis Story interview tonight, where we're going to be featuring one of our own Areopagus book club members. And tonight we have David Richardson on the scene, and he is going to be our official Mary Sidney candidate. And we're super excited to have him on tonight and sort of give you all his pitch about why he thinks Mary is a very serious candidate to consider. And so, yeah, David, thanks so much for hopping on tonight. We talk to you every single week, and so we're it's now it's official that we're sort of doing an official collab here, right? But yeah, just to say hi, I was just gonna ask, what got you into, maybe was it the Shakespeare first before the questioning Shakespeare, or was it the Shakespeare scene right away? Yeah, I was just gonna ask you what kind of got you into the scene.
No, 10 years ago, I probably first really encountered the Shakespeare authorship question, and I thought it was stupid. Um, so it took me a little while to get there. A little before that, I bought a house on Shakespeare Avenue in Chicago, and that was the inspiration for my real immersion in Shakespeare. My daughter was 9 when we bought the house, and we thought 9 was a good time to encounter Shakespeare. And Chicago is a great theater city, and so we started going to a lot of Shakespeare plays. And my professional background is as a marketing economist, and particularly I study how information shapes people's behavior, how people make sense of information in order to understand the world that they act in. And a lot of the philosophical, behavioral, professional questions that I deal with in my work are reflected or considered in Shakespeare. And so when I started to really pay attention to the plays, I started to pick up on stuff, and I was thinking, wow, I didn't realize that Shakespeare or Elizabethan dramatists were really interested in epistemological questions about how we know what's truth, in how we know what other people are thinking, doing, believing. And as I started to explore, was there a literature behind this, and started reading more of the academic literature, it pretty quickly became clear that there was, in fact, this real interest in literary critical theory and the ideas of what printed material, what written material could teach people about how the world worked and how you could learn from the world and how different viewpoints might collide and give rise to different perspectives and different behaviors. And so that was what really drew me in. I had a previous background in philosophy generally, and particularly the philosophy of the 16th century. And so I knew a lot about John Dee, for instance. And so I had a background for some of the context, the intellectual context of the 1600s. As I started to explore the literary critical context of the 1600s, I learned a lot about Philip Sidney and Philip Sidney's impact on these different writers, and then um, looking at how he fit into continental critical theory. I started to have a framework for considering these questions that informed the way that I thought about how maybe the writers in this period were engaging with one another and with the intellectual context of their time.
Wow. Okay. That's not the usual route for most people into the sec. Most people kind of see it on the post-it note or the YouTube video, and then, oh wow, neat, and then but yours is a very kind of it was rooted in what you did, and as as a professional, the things that you've studied your whole life, it elucidated the plays, and somehow vice versa, the plays elucidated the things that you were doing. And that's interesting to me that, like, um, it's a very authentic take on the Shakespeare authorship question. That it's not some flitting hobby. That it's embedded into your work. And so I think that's a unique take. Maybe not wholly. I mean, I think a lot of people that study law, study medicine, kind of have similar takes on
Yeah.
Shakespeare. But I'm noticing that's maybe this has been sort of a late push to get psychologists more and more into the Shakespeare authorship question, or just the soft sciences, the social sciences, and I feel like that's where the newer, hipper ground is. We've seen the lawyers pitch this, we've seen the
Yeah, you've had
doctors pitch.
we've had lawyers for a long time, right? There's law in here, and did Shakespeare study the law, particularly from advocates of other candidates? I think for me, the thing that I find really striking, because my background in economics and in behavioral economics, there is an element of cognitive psychology. There are elements of group decision making, so political science. And so when I look at Shakespeare, I see really conscious examinations of some of the key ideas and conflicts that arise in those contexts. So I have a paper about Titus Andronicus and its relationship to one of the key papers in cognitive psychology that was written in 1959, and I think is for me is one of the most informative um, ideas about how people respond to information. And for me, Titus Andronicus seems to very carefully sort of lay out the issues that emerge in that paper just 350 years earlier. Um, and I think that's pretty amazing. I think that as I work through different plays, different works, I see a lot of that kind of prescience in Shakespeare. And I think there is a tendency to think of Shakespeare as somebody who maybe speaks to humanist concepts of what it is to be a person, and to sort of the standard, what is love, and how do we and love, revenge, sort of basic questions. And for me, I see a lot of Shakespeare dealing with much more complicated questions about how do you live in a social society, what's the role of hierarchy and order, and when should you push against that, when should you work within that. Um, so lots of really interesting questions that we are still working to resolve, sometimes not very successfully. And so, one thing that I hope eventually will come from my work on Shakespeare is reviving an interest in reading Shakespeare for insights into the modern world and modern problems, and not in the simple, let me give a 10-minute talk on Shakespeare as a management specialist, management theorist, but often there are not great works that really explore these concepts. Felstinger and Carl Smith, this article, this cognitive psychology article, um, is not very well known, is not very well understood, and I think it could be easily taught through Shakespeare. So we have that. One of my favorite Shakespearean, traditional Orthodox Shakespearean scholars was a guy named Paul Cantor, who had a joint appointment in political science and Shakespeare at University of Virginia for decades, and his lectures speak to how Shakespeare explored the concepts of political science, both the ones that he inherited from classical traditions, but also the ones that Enlightenment political theorists and even modern political scientists really think of as key questions that a polity needs to resolve in terms of how it governs itself and how individuals within a polity should behave ethically with response to them to one another and to the state.
Fascinating.
A
Fascinating.
lot of that take kind of, since you're talking about economics and behavioral economics and some of that, you're in Chicago, so isn't that where the Freakonomics guys are also located too? So just kind of
That is
reminds
where the
me.
Freakonomics guys are. The I know the Freakonomics guys, so and there's something.
And it just kind of
Um,
reminds me of, like, in modern times we have someone like Thomas Pynchon, who is known, like, one of his famous short stories, and it's got all these layered metaphors about, it's like a party, but it kind of ends up being like a layered metaphor for, like, entropy, right? Where a lot of sciencey, but how the sciencey entropy also reflects the people in the room and society at large and a larger psychology or something, right? So yeah, it's almost like, the study of all this stuff is almost like thermodynamics, but on like a macro scale or something like that, right? Yeah, we can zoom in, zoom in. It's just heat exchange. It's just energy transfer. But then, this energy is just blown up to a larger scale, kind of. Then, we just have all these layered metaphors and derivatives for explaining all this stuff, and then it becomes economics. When at the sub thing, it's some other sciencey thing. But that's just kind of reminds me of. I don't know if that's totally apt or not, but. Um, yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of things we kind of get out of that. One is the thing that the Freakonomics guys are actually famous for is for cleverly using statistics to extract information about real world problems. And I think there is a certain lack of statistical sophistication in the people on every side of the Shakespeare question. So one of the things that I think needs attention and discussion is just how do we use the principles of understanding empirical data to inform the way that we interpret the information we find. And this is becoming important, particularly important because increasingly people are using tools like search in digital texts and large language models that are parsing large text corpuses and finding things. And there's a big difference between looking at something for which is specific to the problem you're examining and asking how can we best interpret this, and looking at some huge body of text and saying, can we find this word or this combination of words in it? And there are statistical consequences for sifting through a vast amount of information to find something which you then interpret as having meaning when in fact it might be coincidental. So if I can tip something coming up, I'm supposed to debate Dennis McCarthy, who is the advocate for Thomas North, a week from Sunday, on the question of the upstart crow, which is a reference in Robert Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit from 1592. And in 1787, a guy named Thomas Tyrwhitt found a copy of Groat's Worth of Wit and found this reference to an upstart crow colored with our feathers who fashions himself, who thinks of himself as the only Shakespeare in the country. And he said, looks like this is a discussion of an actor. Looks like it's maybe an actor who's writing stuff and it has the word shake in it. That's got to be a reference to Shakespeare, right? Nobody had access, nobody knew really anything about Shakespeare, 150 years after he died.
Right.
And this was, we were entering the age of biography. So it wasn't unusual that nobody knew much of anything about Shakespeare in the 1600s. We didn't have biographies, written biographies for almost anybody except monarchs. Um, and as we moved into the late 17 and early 1800s, biography became fashionable. It became part of being educated to know the stories of important men, whether they were Greeks or Romans or the authors and scientists who had shaped the 19th century world. And so when people looked at Shakespeare and kind of had this cipher, there were a couple things that had pointed them to this guy who lived in Stratford about the same time, but not very much to connect them, and nothing really that had surfaced to inform a biography of this man as an author. We had the works, and we had some information about a guy who lived and married and died in Stratford, but they didn't add up to a biography. Um, a lawyer named Edmund Malone was tasked with trying to construct a biography for Shakespeare and reviewed what had been done. There was an effort to write his story by a guy named Nicholas Rowe in the early 1700s, and he found basically nothing, made some stuff up, or found some apocryphal stories about him poaching deer and some other things, most of which are now pretty much accepted to be simply not true, not possibly true, because they involve a forest which didn't exist and other instances and contexts that with a lot of additional research have proven to be just not possible. So
Right.
Malone found that coming in up to 1800, when he was tasked to do this, there was basically no information for him to write a biography of this author. The information that was available, he could pretty conclusively demonstrate was not reliable, almost certainly not true. He had a couple pieces of evidence. So he had Tyrwhitt's Green's worth of wit mentions Shakespeare in 1592. So we're kind of going to grab onto that. And they discovered Shakespeare's will about the same time, a couple of years earlier than that. And Shakespeare's will just doesn't generally support the idea that he was a famous author and actor, but there is an interlined bequest of 60 shillings, 20 shillings each to buy rings for three members of the Shakespeare Burbage Acting Company. And so that was what Malone had. We get into the 1800s and more things start to surface that people try to put on Shakespeare. But this process of grabbing on to anything, to sifting this vast amount of documentary evidence and literary evidence for anything that chimes of Shakespeare or Stratford, and then attaching it to the Shakespeare biography creates real problems, which have to do with the reliability of data and the ability to interpret it depends a great deal on how hard you look for it. And if you go searching through tens of thousands of lines of poetry and drama and letters uh, for any word that matches, if you grab onto shake and decide that's got to be every use of the word shake and decide that's got to be a Shakespeare reference, you're going to pull in a lot of stuff which doesn't properly belong there. Which is not to say we can just rule it out, but we should be looking critically at what is the evidence and is there a better reading in context, or even just an alternative reading, which may be a different explanation for how that stuff got there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wanted to maybe touch on, yeah, it's always a lot when David shares, guys. Like, we get this every Sunday. Like, that's how spoiled we are. But at the start of that, David was mentioning, look, these Freakonomics guys, they don't go and try to find statistics. They don't mishmash the statistics. They look at the statistics and interpret it and sort of test those interpretations. And we're not doing that no matter what side of the coin you're on right now. No matter if you're some crazy internet crank like, pick a name, maybe us, maybe somebody else, or whether you are the absolute most orthodox person out there, like knighted Sir Brian Vickers, the great Thomas Kidd scholar. Nobody's really using these statistical analyses correctly, at least according to the sort of rigor and methodologies that are, you know, in studies that are constantly using statistics.
Yeah, so statisticians have rules about how to handle the statistical value, the inference value of information, and some of those rules change depending on how you find the information. And there doesn't seem to be much awareness of how you need to adjust your interpretation of data depending on how it turned up. So that's one methodological thing that I think generally this field, as it matures, will get to a better understanding of. I think the question that sort of I outlined, that this absence of information about biography of the writer and the man from Stratford. Um, there is this received view, that the biography is continuously accepted from the time that people who lived at the time of people who lived with Shakespeare. And so this evidence, which we know now, it informs the orthodox view of Shakespeare's life, that he was an actor and then he started writing, and he was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's men and he wrote more, and then he abandoned his wife in Stratford, or maybe he didn't, because now there's supposed to be a letter that proves that she was living with him in London. All of these things, the one thing that we can be sure of is that there's nobody that in 1800, when Edmund Malone is looking at the record about Shakespeare, there was no one, and by the time he finished his research, there was no one alive who knew more about Shakespeare than Edmund Malone. There was no reservoir of received information that provided continuous, not public, continuous private information that somehow validated some set of stories that was being carried around. Shakespeare was invented out of the evidence. I think there's a good case to be made that the original identification of the man from Stratford was invented out of the evidence. That whatever the truth known by people who were close to the writer, and you have to assume there were such people, that the people that discovered Shakespeare in Stratford, and we kind of know who they are, at least the ones that survived from the historical record. There's a lieutenant who visited Stratford in 1632, and he records in his diary the Shakespeare Monument, the writing on the plaque on the Shakespeare Monument, which seems to imply that the statue was there then. We have the wording in the first folio paratext, the poetry that's at the front of the first folio, where Johnson calls Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon, and Leonard Digges refers to his Stratford monument. And there is no reason to suppose that the people who went to Stratford on Avon knew any more than that the folio mentioned the names Stratford and Avon. And when they went there, they found what appeared to be a monument to the writer. And so in
That's awesome.
1640, Benson's volume of poetry, of Shakespeare's poetry, comes out. Shakespeare's poetry wasn't included in the first folio, but was printed along with some apocryphal stuff and some poems nominally about Shakespeare in 1640 in a volume that we don't regard as very trustworthy. The publisher, the editor, um, rearranged the order of the poems, edited some of them so they didn't make it sound like maybe he was gay. Um, we 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 don't generally think of Benson as being the best source of reliable information. Benson has a poem which is read as a eulogy to Shakespeare, which we now believe was written by a guy named William Bass,
Okay.
and which seems to be referenced by Johnson in the folio. And in the 1640 printing, he attached to that poem, which had been circulating in manuscript, and we have 20 odd versions of the manuscript from this period. Some of those manuscripts had attached to them died 1616 in Stratford. That does not appear to be authorial. It appears to be something added by people who went to Stratford and found this monument and attached it. And so we have this accumulation of this story, which then it finally reaches Edmund Malone a couple centuries later, and he puts the pieces together in the best way he can. There's more evidence discovered in the 1800s. There's some evidence manufactured in the 1800s, and the story of John Payne Collier and stuff he inserted into the historical record, we might talk about in a bit, or we might talk about in some other context. But people should be aware that sort of by the middle of the 1800s, we knew a lot about Shakespeare, most of which we now know was invented in the first half of the 1800s by a guy who was the leading Shakespeare scholar of the first half of the 1800s. But when he was frustrated by the lack of evidence, started inserting stuff into the historical record. And because he had access to the actual historical documents, to things like Henslow's diary and to the Treasury Office records, he could just write lines in to make the stuff that he couldn't find in the records he had encountered appear in the historical record. The first reference to Shakespeare in the theater is a contract for the Blackfriars Theater for the Richard Burbage acting company, the company that Shakespeare will later be a part of. Um, and it would be wonderful, except that we know that Collier invented it and inserted it into the record amongst these actual historical documents. So nobody regards that as a genuine record anymore. There are a bunch of other records that were discovered and then thrown out. But there are also records that were discovered after Payne had access to the records, which surfaced later. And almost everything that was found in the 1800s, which is pretty much everything we know about Shakespeare, has to have some element of skepticism directed to it, um, because we know these handwritten documents were worked over. And
Yeah.
so it becomes the question of when did Shakespeare, when did the Shakespeare authorship question arise? When did people really challenge the conventional story? The thing that everybody should have in mind when when you're thinking about that question, is there was no meaningful official story until the middle of the 19th century, almost more than 200 years after Shakespeare was dead, when we started putting together bits of real and contrived evidence and literary evidence into biography. And various people looked at it. Some of them said, this is not possible. Malone said, it's not possible based on the evidence to construct a biography of Shakespeare. Other people looked at it and said, yeah, we'll take a look. Right? And Collier, of course, is one of the first people to write a biography of Shakespeare, unfortunately informed by the stuff that he himself manufactured and inserted into the historical record. So we get so over the next 150 years, people go back and forth. Is this a story we can tell? Is there enough data to support it? The one thing we know is that whatever the story is, it's created by people who had no more, and in the most cases, less access to the original documents than we do now. And so there's very little reason to respect the judgments that people who only saw a fraction of evidence and were making up stories came to as received wisdom that somehow might reflect the actual experience, the private information of people who lived with and knew Shakespeare, the author, writer, man from Stratford.
Absolutely. Here. Cheers to all of that. I have a personal distaste for Mr. John Payne Collier. I'm kind of a fan of the Henslow Diary. I think it's one of the coolest documents on the planet. I wish more actual Orthodox Shakespeare scholars took it more seriously and really gave it the precedence that it should have. I think it gets tossed off as this sort of weird auxiliary document when, honest to God, it is the most on the ground document to understand the theatrical scene of the time, and that should be the center of our knowledge and not some auxiliary piece that's put off
Yeah,
as an auxiliary, you know, specifically because we've got this construction of Shakespeare at the center.
I think the people who really study the culture and history of the playhouses and the players know and rely on Henslow
Yeah,
a lot.
they
The
do.
people who study Shakespeare are frustrated that Henslow doesn't mention Shakespeare's name. So you have this, so it's, and that may not mean anything. Shakespeare seems to have been not in Henslow, not writing for or acting for Henslow's company. And so it's not shocking that he doesn't appear in the business records that we have from Henslow. And unfortunately, the Burbage company that Shakespeare is associated with did not leave comparable documents about their purchases of plays and their performance history. Although there's a fair amount of information about the performance history of the Burbage Company, just because playing, doing plays for thousands of people in a public venue is a very public thing to do. And so that does generate records of performance. We have records of court performance. We have people who record their experiences of going to the theater. We have, the story about how during a performance of Henry VIII that the Globe in 1613, they set off a cannon, which set a spark into the thatched roof of the place and eventually burned the whole thing to the ground. We have uh, we have period documents that speak to the existence and the experience and the history of the theater, even if we don't have good company documents for that.
Very
Absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's good that we kind of got off into we have a good, interesting primer into not just talking about what we're going to talk about in a second, but also your own interesting things to present about the man from Stratford and questioning Shakespeare in general, right? Because that's something we always sort of need to refute in this scene, and that's often where we start to find the plot holes in the Shakespeare Stratford man from Stratford biography that kind of maybe gives us our hints about where to go looking. But yeah, a lot of that stuff is very interesting in presenting the Shaky biography, but without relying on to the man from Stratford too much, let's get to the starette of the show, maybe perhaps. And so, yeah, who we're talking about is Mary Sidney, and we've definitely talked about her brother a lot on our channel. And yeah, we started to see some of those talks at these Oxfordian conventions, and a lot of more Sydney names start to pop up, right? And so David's is one of his lectures that he gave was right up our alley. We pretty much hooked onto it, and yeah, he was pretty much like, yeah, guys, finish burying Sydney. Let's go on to Mary now, right? Finish burying Philip. I'm sorry, yeah, finish burying Philip, and we'll go on to Mary here. So yeah, and obviously, yeah, as you can already tell, I asked for like one little thing, or not that it's bad, but yeah, he's just able to like kind of riff and go, and yeah, such a cohesive understanding of the history and the period. And so yeah, with that leading into it, Bacons, they have their ciphers, Oxfordians have their wiki diving methodology or whatever. They have their little, they think their gotcha moments, right? What lends you to believe that, what's the big things that you think that Mary or where you find Mary's fingerprints in Shakespeare? And maybe you also just probably give us like a cursory little background of her life in general for those who maybe aren't up to speed with her as well.
So Mary was born in 1561. She was born in Tickenhill Palace in Bodley, which is a little town just west of Birmingham. It's about 30 miles from Stratford-on-Avon. So they're both sort of suburbs of Birmingham. Bodley Castle or Tickenhill Castle was a royal castle, which at the time was being used by her father, who was the president of the Council of Wales. So you need a little background on the Sidney family. Her grandfather was a man named William Sidney. Sir William Sidney was the knight who Henry VIII chose to be the steward of the royal prince's household. So William Sidney had been a friend, a retainer, a servant of Henry VIII. He was also a great scholar. And so when Henry wanted someplace to put his kid, Edward the later Edward the Sixth, or Edward the Sixth, he wanted to his children. So Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward are all alive at this point. He wanted to keep them away from the business of the court, so that if there was a plague, if there was a communicable disease that ravaged through the court, potentially killing him, that his children would be somewhat isolated. And so they created this space for the prince to be educated, but to avoid sort of the regular interactions with huge numbers of people coming from all different places, where he would be constantly exposed to potentially fatal diseases. So they did this at a castle that belonged to the king, called Hunsdon. And they brought in the best scholars of the time, because we had already made the Protestant break. Those tended to be Protestant in their theology, but respected scholars like Ascom and Czech were brought in to design a program of instruction for the young prince. There were a number of nobles from children of noble families that were educated with the prince. So the children of the Seymours, his cousins, by virtue of his being the son of Jane Seymour. The Grey sisters, also cousins, and people who know their Tudor history know that Edward arranged for the succession after his death not to go to one of his sisters, but to go to Jane Grey, a cousin. That did not go well, and she did not survive. When Henry died in 1549, Edward was still 12 years old. And so there was a regency established. At first, it was his two Seymour uncles and a man named Thomas Dudley, who and they eventually fell out, and the two Seymour brothers were executed, and Dudley became the sole regent, and appointed himself Duke of Northumberland, and tried to structure the court around Edward, in depending on whose views of history, in a way that satisfied Henry and Edward's expectations for where the country would go, but also in a way that was self-serving for Thomas Dudley. Part of that was that he made marriages to reinforce the position of his family, and then later, when there was later to create a succession and to create noble alliances to support Jane Grey, who they wanted to replace, to take the throne after Edward died. One of those alliances they made was to marry Thomas's daughter, Mary Dudley, to the son of William Sidney. And the son, Henry, was important because although he was 7 years older, I think, than or 9 years older than Edward, he was Edward's best friend and childhood playmate. And in fact, when Edward died in 1554, he died in Henry Sidney's arms. So Henry Sidney was, until Edward, and Edward was not there's a misperception that Edward was a sickly child. Edward was quite a robust child, if not a stout one in the mold of his father. He was more slender, more a scholar, but he was an avid hunter. He was an avid falconer. He was and he had a reputation for scholarship. And Henry Sidney was set up to be his Charles Brandon. So Henry VIII had a childhood friend he grew up with, remained his closest friend throughout his life. Charles Brandon became a duke, married his sister, not entirely with Henry's blessing, but in any event, all of the English heirs to the throne besides Mary and Elizabeth were descended from Charles Brandon. So there was this expectation that Henry Sidney was going to follow in that path. He was going to be a leading counselor in Edward's court. He was going to be, as his best friend, was going to be elevated to a duchy, and so one of the leading nobles, and his life was set. And then Edward dies just before his 17th birthday, and Henry's prospects diminished considerably. His wife is married to the Lord Protector, and they've just tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Mary comes down with an army from Scotland. The Howards support her. A bunch of other nobles that had pledged their support to Thomas Dudley and to Jane Grey switch sides. One of those is a guy named William Herbert. We have William Sidney on one side and William Herbert, who will become important to this story in a little bit. William Herbert had arranged for his son Henry. William Herbert was the first Earl of Pembroke. He arranged for his son Henry to marry one of Elizabeth Grey's sisters, Elizabeth Grey. And when Mary marched south with an army, he flipped. Thomas Dudley was out of town putting down a rebellion in Sussex, and Pembroke made a deal and sold out the Greys, sold out the Dudleys, and got enormous lands in England as a consequence of the deal he made. And the marriage he'd made between his son Henry and the Grey cousin was annulled. And this will become important because the same Henry Herbert will marry Henry Sidney's daughter Mary when she's 15 years old in 1575, 1576. So that will be the next part of her story. At any rate, Henry is now married to Mary. He is not one of the Dudleys who's caught up in the transfer of power to Mary. And fortunately, another Sidney marriage was to a guy named Thomas Radcliffe, who was in line to become the next Earl of Sussex. And he was accounted a Catholic, whether he was or not. He certainly was more fluid in his religious beliefs and was one of the nobles that Mary relied on. And so he became a sort of support for Henry Sidney when the rest of the Dudley family was out of favor. And in fact, Thomas and two of his sons were executed for plotting to oppose Mary, and eventually Jane Grey and Guildford Dudley, another son of Thomas, were also executed. So the Sidney Dudley family was not in good shape come 1554 when Mary took over. The ones that did not die in the first months of her reign survived and were mostly restored when Elizabeth became queen. And Elizabeth had grown up, like the rest of the royal children, had grown up with the Sidneys and the Dudleys. And of course, we know, she had this lifelong relationship with Robert Dudley as her favorite, potentially her lover. Robert Dudley, by virtue of Mary being married to his sister Mary being married to Henry Sidney, was then uncle to Philip Sidney, who was born in 1554, just after Mary took the throne, and against all previous expectations, in an effort to sort of reconcile with the nobles that might have opposed her, Queen Mary arranged for her husband Philip of Spain to be Philip Sidney, Henry Sidney's son's godfather. So we have this curious relationship in which Henry is sort of out of favor, but a childhood friend well known to Queen Mary, later well known to Elizabeth. The Sidneys have this close relationship to the Dudleys, to the crown. Henry Sidney becomes from the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, becomes the Lord President of the Council of Wales. So he governs Wales, one of the countries that Elizabeth reigns over. And Later, he's appointed the Lord Deputy of Ireland, so he rules two of the countries over which Elizabeth is monarch. So there's this weird place where the Sidneys are very noble and not very noble. So Henry is offered a barony in 1569. So 10 years into Elizabeth's reign, he is the Lord President of Wales. He is a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honors available, dating back to the days of Edward. So he is this very important person, but he rejects, because of the costs he's incurred in Ireland and Wales, he rejects the offer of a barony if it doesn't come with sufficient income. So Henry Sidney is not a titled noble, although he's running a third of Elizabeth, a third of Great Britain for Elizabeth. And his son, for most of his life, we know is Sir Philip Sidney, but isn't even knighted until a couple years before his death, because Elizabeth has this complicated relationship with the Sidneys. So Mary is born in 1561, 7 years after Philip, a couple years into the reign of Elizabeth. 2 years, no, the following year, her mother Mary is with Elizabeth when when Elizabeth is struck with smallpox. Queen Elizabeth is struck with smallpox, and it falls on Mary to nurse her through that. And in the process of nursing her through her smallpox infection, Mary Dudley Sidney is infected with smallpox. Elizabeth is largely unaffected. People debate whether she had, complexion issues that she covered up with makeup later, but there doesn't seem to have been a great any great physical or aesthetic damage to Elizabeth. But Mary, who was accounted one of the great beauties of the court, was terribly scarred on her face, and afterwards in public, she almost always wore a veil. So we have this very interesting dynamic of this close friend, Mary Sidney, of Queen Elizabeth, who's once was a great beauty, has lost her beauty, is now, but remains a friend of Elizabeth and stays at court, while Henry Sidney, her husband, is being sent to Wales and Ireland and mostly required to stay to administer those provinces. And so they are often separated. It would appear every time they are not separated, they conceive another child. So there's something to that. And in the end, there are 5 children in the family, 2 girls, Mary and a sister Ambrosia, and 3 boys, Philip, his younger brother Robert, and a yet younger brother Thomas. And all of them get the sort of education you would expect for children of the family that educated the king. So Philip at age 6 goes to Shrewsbury School. It seems like the rest are more educated at home. Mary seems to have gotten more or less the same education as her brothers, perhaps more because Philip seems to have been sending her books and instructions on what to read, a process he also followed with his brother Robert. So Mary grows up in this weird environment where for part of her youth she is sort of the Princess of Ireland, living in Dublin Castle, which her father rebuilt. For some of it, she is living in Ludlow Castle, which is used as the capital of Wales during the period that Henry is administering it. And then the Sidneys were given by Henry VIII a castle called Penshurst, which is in Kent, about 20, 30 miles south of London. It was, interestingly, the castle from which Henry VIII wooed Anne Boleyn. as the castle where she was brought up was just a few miles west of it. And so Henry used that as his base for the court so that he could court Anne and Mary Boleyn. Um, so that's a different story altogether. Um, but so we have Mary brought up in this very intellectual family, this very literary family. Philip is educated at Shrewsbury School, then goes to Oxford for a few years. He doesn't appear to have taken a degree at Oxford, which was typical of young noblemen. And then in 1572, he's sent, so that he's just 17, he's sent to the continent to sort of do the Elizabethan version of a grand tour, meet the royals and nobles on the continent. He has a letter of introduction. There is some evidence that they decided to call him the Prince of Ireland as he was traveling about. He seems to have made a tremendous impression. So Charles the Ninth, the King of France, is so taken with him that he makes him a Baron of France, although he's not titled or even a knight in England. So he has a nominal title, the Baron de Sidney, in France. And he meets the leaders of the Protestant states of Germany. He meets the leaders of Venice, where he spends some time. And in particular, he meets a man named Hubert Languet, who is a French Protestant intellectual, who is one of the closest men to a couple of really important people, Henry of Navarre, who will, by the end of the century, become the King of France, and Philip Melanchthon, who was sort of the right-hand man and successor to Martin Luther, and led a movement based in Wittenberg, a place which will become important in Shakespeare lore, led a movement towards sort of a unified theology, which might bridge the differences between the Catholics and Protestants in Europe. So Philip, now just 17, 18, 19, is having this experience in Europe. He has a negative experience in 1572 when he's visiting the French court. He is present for the Bartholomew's Day massacre when when Languet's friend and patron, the King of Navarre, Henry of Navarre, is supposed to marry the sister of the French king in an effort to reconcile the Protestant and French factions. Catherine de' Medici, the French, the mother of the French kings, in fact, the mother of the next three French kings, arrange plots with the Duc de Guise, the leader of the Catholic anti-Protestant faction, to massacre all the Protestants in Paris. And Philip is present for that. He's actually traveling in the company of Francis Walsingham, and Walsingham arranges to protect him in the English embassy, and they survive the carnage. And he and Languet end up traveling throughout Europe, with Languet making introductions to pretty much all of the important people outside of Philip's godfather, the King of Spain. They don't go to Spain, they don't go to Rome, but they do go to northern Italy and France and Germany and Austria. He visits Vienna, and he establishes personal relationships with intellectuals and with politicians or influential people. And there are crazy stories that there is some sort of notion to offer to make him the king of Poland, to make him the king of the Low Countries. Um, really crazy things. It's not clear whether any of those have much truth behind them, but they do sort of reflect the sense that this guy, who doesn't have any official portfolio from his home country of England, is somehow destined to be a great leader of the pan-European, of some sort of pan-European Protestant or combined or trans-religious union. And that sort of informs the Sidney family. It informs their um, politics, which is definitely pro-Protestant and anti sort of Catholic hegemony, but which is also tolerant of other religions. So they're personally tolerant, and there are records of them protecting Catholics, but politically strongly aligned with Protestant movements in England and on the continent. And that becomes part of the later story. So Philip when Philip comes back to England, he becomes cupbearer to the Queen. He gets some ambassadorial appointments, but he's sort of this courtier on the edge of Elizabeth's court. She expects him to fill sort of the favorite role in the way that his uncle Robert Dudley had, and some of his friends, Edward Dyer, Christopher Hatton, um, later Raleigh, all friends of are all part of Philip's circle of friends. But Philip doesn't seem comfortable in that role, possibly because the leading favorite is his uncle, and that's just weird. Um, in however, his uncle Robert marries. After he gives up on marrying the queen, he marries a woman named between Lettice Knollys, who is the widow of Walter Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and as a consequence, is out of favor with the queen at the end of the 1570s when she finds out. She finds out as part of a plot by the French to marry her to the Duc d'Alençon, the brother of the French king, uh, and um, and so the pro-Catholic, pro-union with France or Spain factions, which in England is always the Howards and occasionally some related people, plot against Dudley. Sometimes Burleigh, William Cecil, the Lord Treasurer, Lord Burleigh, joins them in trying to make alliances. Burleigh never trusts Dudley and wants to limit his power. So because Dudley is out of favor, it falls on Philip to oppose the French marriage to Alençon. He writes a letter in 1579 laying out the reasons for Elizabeth why she shouldn't do that. He doesn't publish the letter, but it circulates within the court. She gets mad. And so that gets him into trouble. He also gets into trouble because the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, who favors the match and is part of a small group of old family Catholics that think they're going to be able to recover their family fortunes if the French if this French prince marries the queen, and some additional tolerance for Catholicism is allowed. They end up having a quarrel. They actually run into one another on a tennis court at Greenwich Palace. Um, and they have a quarrel, which leads to a challenge to a duel. The queen finds out, summons them in and tells them, don't be stupid, you can't have a duel. And particularly to Philip says, you are not a noble, You are not even a knight. You are just Mr. Mr. Sidney, and you have no business fighting duels with earls. So sort of runs him out of town. It's not clear whether he just slinks off or whether she actually banishes him from the court. And Philip ends up spending a good chunk of the next couple years hanging out with his sister Mary, who has married the son of William Pembroke, the guy who switched sides to put Mary Tudor on the throne. His son Henry, who is 27 years her senior. So when they marry, she's 15 and he's 42. Um, and on his third wife, depending on, or his second, depending on whether you count the initial annulled marriage when he was a teenager to Elizabeth Grey. He had in between, he had married a woman who was very close to Queen Elizabeth, but she didn't bear him a child. So here he is, he's 42, and he has no heir. He needs an heir. Mary Sidney is now, like her mother, great beauty of the court, reputed to be great wit and a great scholar, the catch, and of an age where she's likely to have, she's able to produce heirs for some time to come. In fact, in 1580, when Philip is exiled from the court, she is pregnant with her first child, who will later be born William Herbert. And Philip entertains her while she's pregnant, brings her pages of written material, which will later be his Arcadia, his great romance, and his sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella, and his book of critical theory, the Defense of Poesy. And so all of those seem to come out of this period when they are together, when he is living with her or at her, near to her estate Wilton, which is in Wiltshire, on the River Avon, near Shrewsbury. And then he eventually, unable to get an appointment at court, when his uncle, who is now Earl of Leicester, takes the appointment as Governor General of the Low Countries to defend the Low Countries from Spain. They're trying to break away from Spain. Philip takes an appointment as a military man under him, eventually becoming the governor of the town of Flushing, or the city of Flushing. And it is there that he is killed in a battle, and becomes sort of this, partially because of his family history, partially because he has this reputation as a writer and a scholar, partially because he had made a name for himself on the continent, and partially just because England desperately needed some sort of rallying point for the anticipated arrival of the Spanish Armada. All of these things came together, and people decided to make Philip Sidney some sort of Protestant martyr and hero of the Elizabethan cause. So he became, whatever he had been before, he becomes this great courtier knight, the flower of English knighthood, and the representation of all that is noble in England. And so his story becomes Mary's story because Philip made her dedicated his written works to her and entrusted them to her. But after his death, after this process of this huge funeral, this huge state funeral, and this process of making him into this political figure after death, he then becomes a brand that the various factions at court want to associate with. One of those factions is the Earl of Essex, Robert Robert Devereux, who is the son of Walter, um, uh, and who becomes the great favorite of the Queen in the 1590s, and tries to bring together a group of supporters around him, and opposed to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, the man who is running the government for Elizabeth. And eventually, it is Robert Cecil, William Cecil's son, who succeeds him to his offices, but becomes the great enemy of Essex, who plots against him. So a bunch of Philip Sidney's friends, Fulk Greville and John Florio and others, fall into this group of people supporting Essex, and they try to publish Philip's works for Essex. And so it falls on Mary, or Mary decides that she wants to define her brother's legacy. And so by various means, she eventually gets the rights to publish his works, republish his works, and re-edits them and produces them in her name, in his name, but under her direction. So by 1598, we finally get a complete edition of Philip Sidney's works that have all of these things. Uh, Mary becomes an author in her own right. So before he died, she and Philip work on a translation of the Psalms, which becomes known as the Sidney Psalter. And he writes 43, she writes the rest. When they are finally published, they're not published. When they circulate, they have this enormous impact on English devotional poetry. So scholars generally see Mary's Psalms as the basis for basically all lyric poetry in England afterwards, certainly on the devotional poets, George Herbert and John Donne, who both seem to be associated with her, but certainly use her translations of the Psalms as the basis for their evolution of English poetry. She also writes translations of contemporary continental works, Discourse of Life and Death by Philip de Mornay, and Petrarch's Triumph of Death, and a play on the death of Antony and Cleopatra, which is a translation of a play by a guy named Robert Garnier, who's sort of in the avant-garde of the French theater. You may see a communality of interest there, in that she seems to be obsessed with death and questions of life and death and the purpose of life in a couple of years after her brother's death. She publishes the Mornay translation, Discourse on Life and Death, and the Antony play in 1591 under her own name. That's the only work she publishes under her own name. But the Antony play shows command of blank verse. It shows the intervals, the choruses are written in verse, in rhyming verse. And so the combination of her known works establish her as certainly the greatest female writer of the age. And to take one assessment, the great Victorian compiler of Elizabethan literature, a man named Alexander Grossart, when he published Philip Sidney's works, he reviewed the Psalms, came to the conclusion that only the first 43 were Philip's works, but in the volume wrote that he regretted that he couldn't include Mary's Psalms because they were infinitely superior in poetic expression and thought, which gives you some measure of just how great a writer, an objective measure of how great a writer she was. So we have Mary, who is associated with the great pre-Shakespearean writer Philip Sidney, who is herself a great writer who has an established interest in theater through her interest in Garnier. She appears to have taken on Thomas Kidd as a secretary, or Henry Herbert, her husband, does, before he writes the Spanish tragedy, which, along with Marlowe's works, is one of the transformative works in the theater of the mid 1580s. He seems to have taken some some ideas for Spanish tragedy from translating Corneille, another work by Robert Garnier, apparently at the direction of Mary Sidney. So by the mid 1580s, after Philip's death, she's already influencing the direction of the theater. There is evidence that Christopher Marlowe also went to work for her in the couple of years before his death. We have the evidence for both of those is a letter that Thomas Kidd wrote after he was arrested and tortured and Marlowe was killed, asking for help with his unidentified patron. But the details of that letter suggest that both Marlowe and Kidd were working for Mary, and Mary, or at least her husband, the Earl of Pembroke, sponsored the first Shakespeare acting company. So there seems to have been some sort of argument between Richard Burbage and Ned Allen, the lead actor of The Admiral's Men, Strange's Men, and they split up, and Burbage went to the Pembrokes for patronage. And during that period, 1592, 1593, when the Pembrokes sponsored the Burbage Company, is when the first plays we identify with Shakespeare were apparently performed, and they have Pembroke's name on the title page instead of Shakespeare. There's no authorial identification. So all the
Let me ask you
pieces.
real quick. When that happens, Ned Allen and his group, do they immediately become admiral's men, or do they have another title? Or are they still running under Stranges at this time?
So the question of who exactly Ned Allen is working for at any particular time in the period from 1589 to 1594 is very complicated. The scholars seem to think that at some point he's a member of both the Admiral's Men. The Admiral is Charles Howard, the soon to be Earl of Nottingham, and Lord Admiral. Lord Strange is the courtesy title for the Earl of Derby. So Ferdinando Stanley is Lord Strange. His father, I think it's William Stanley, is the Earl of Derby. When his father dies in late 1593, Ferdinando becomes the Earl of Derby, but then dies under mysterious circumstances, possibly illness, possibly poisoning. Just a few months later, Ferdinando is interesting because he is second in line amongst the English heirs to the throne. So his mother, who is Margaret Stanley, is the heir to the English heir to the throne. So there are two lines of Tudors. Since Elizabeth doesn't have any children, there's the line descended from Mary Tudor, who married Charles Brandon and gave rise to the Greys, and to Margaret. This is Margaret Clifford, who married Ferdinando Stanley to become the Countess of Derby. No, she didn't marry Ferdinando. She married William to become the Countess of Derby. Ferdinando was her son, and so she is next in line to succession among the English possible successors. Ferdinando, if he had survived her, would be next in line and would be the next male heir. But Ferdinando predeceases her. She dies in 1596. So Strange's Men. Ned Allen is associated with both admirals and Stranges. The composition of queens and admirals and Stranges is a little confused. So there seems to be some question about which of those people are actively supporting this company, the Ned Allen Company, which is associated with Henslow's Rose during this period. And it's a period where the companies themselves are somewhat fluid. We finally get clarity. Burbage joins Pembroke's after Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe are arrested, and Kidd is tortured and Marlowe is killed. A couple of months later, the Pembrokes, for whatever reason, decide maybe they don't want to be involved. The Pembrokes decide maybe they don't want to be involved in the theater anymore. And so their company, Pembroke's, the Richard Burbage company that we think Shakespeare is associated with, then moves to become the Earl of Sussex men. This is not the Earl of Sussex, who is Mary's uncle. This is his brother.
Nephew? Yeah,
I think
sorry.
it's brother first.
And then his nephew, yeah.
Then his nephew, yes. So brother becomes the next Earl of Sussex. He dies in so he dies in December of 1593. So they need another patron. They become briefly the Countess of Sussex men. So if you count that, we get a couple extra names for this company. But then after a brief time, they seem to all come together under Ferdinando Stanley as now Derby's men. So when you look at the playbills from the period, the published quartos from the period, you'll see some version of Strange's, Pembroke's, Sussex's, and Derby's men. Those are not different competing companies. They appear. It is possible that they were just successive companies. So they were originally Strange's with Allen and Burbage in one company. Strange's broke up. Burbage went to Pembroke's. Then Pembroke's became Sussex. Then Sussex became Derby's. Then Derby's became the Lord Chamberlain's men, having run out of nobles to sponsor this company. And so Henry Carey, the Queen's cousin, probably brother, half brother, and Lord Chamberlain now takes over the company. And with his son-in-law, Charles Howard, the Lord Admiral, those now become the two acting companies that then go on to dominate the stage for at least the next 10 years. Although, because apparently owning a playing company or sponsoring a playing company is very bad for your health. Henry Carey dies in 1596, so only 2 years after he became their patron. And then we have a very complicated period, which is theatrically interesting because it involves appointing a Cobham in the place of, who is a strict Protestant and a close ally of Robert Cecil, to the Lord Chamberlainship, and he hates the theater. And so he doesn't sponsor a company of players. So Lord Chamberlain's briefly become Hunsdons under Henry Carey's son, George. And then when Cobham dies after like 8 months in the job, then George becomes the Lord Chamberlain and order is restored, at least for a few years. So at any rate, we have, so in terms of why Mary, we have Mary as the first patron of the company. We have her interest in the theater. We have her relationship to Marlowe and Kidd, and also to Samuel Daniel, who she hires as tutor to her children, and who dedicates to her his Delia sonnets. It's pretty well accepted that the Delia sonnets are the model on which Shakespeare's sonnets are written. So this sonnet sequence with this long poem at the end, that structure is originated by Samuel Daniel. And Daniel also is, in addition to being an influential poet, is an influential historian. And his work on an English history modeled on Lucan's civil wars becomes an important source for Shakespeare. And then there's this wonderful dissertation by a guy named David Weiss, who looks at the source relationship, the textual relationship between Samuel Daniels' histories and Shakespeare's histories, and concludes that they must be writing them together and sharing manuscripts, because the influence in that we see in the plays of the 1590s, Shakespeare's plays of the 1590s, and Daniel's history seems to go both ways. And the most reasonable explanation for that is that they're sharing manuscripts. So we have, under Mary at this time, we have this lovely connection of all the people that are supposed to be associated with Shakespeare and Shakespeare's playing company. After that, after the Lord Chamberlain's Men is formed, we have one record of a payment to Shakespeare, and later records of William Shakespeare being associated with the Burbage Company, but they don't identify whether this William Shakespeare is the author or an actor or the guy from Stratford, right? They're just William Shakespeare is a name associated with the company. So options, we have the guy from Stratford is an actor who is, although there's absolutely no record of it, who's somehow part of Pembroke's men and part of the Countess's circle. And this relationship then defines how he got an education and how he got access to documents, how he got access to Samuel Daniel and Marlowe and Kidd. They're all part of this Pembroke's men group around Mary Sidney. But it also gives rise to this alternative explanation, which is there was no William Shakespeare associated with the theater at all, that Mary adopts the name William Shakespeare based on references, provocations from Thomas Nash, where he addresses her as Pallas Athena, shaking her spear in defense of Philip Sidney's works. And there is certainly a literary back and forth between the Countess and Nash, which echoes in these works, certainly appears to be central to what's going on in Venus and Adonis and its dedication to Southampton. So I have a thing on my website that talk about the Countess and her conflicts with Florio and the Essex circle, and with Nash, who's connected to them in this effort to publish Philip Sidney's works. So we have her at the beginning. There's one reference to William Shakespeare as a corporeal being, that is in the entire time of the Elizabethan and Jacobean theater, when Shakespeare is supposed to be an important actor and writer. No one ever claims to have encountered the author William Shakespeare. We have this guy from Stratford who does seem to have done some business in the city, and he has some interactions with people, but none of those interactions identify him as an author. But there is one period reference to the author. So in 1603, after Elizabeth has died and James, as the new king, comes down into England, there's plague in London, and Mary invites him to come out to Wilton, sending a letter to her son Philip, who is James' first favorite, and says, "Come to Wilton, we have the man Shakespeare with us," which is fascinating because James has made William Shakespeare, as one of the sharers in the Lord Chamberlain's Men. He has made him a groom of the chamber, and so a direct servant to the king. And his company is now the King's Men. So there, months pass, but apparently the king doesn't get to see William Shakespeare, and it's starting to be a matter of interest and suspense. And he gets this invitation from the Countess of Pembroke, "Come, we have William Shakespeare with us." So what does that mean? Well, it might mean that there is no William Shakespeare but Mary, and Mary is now anxious to explain to the new king that it will be difficult for her to serve as a groom of the chamber. But we don't know. And this is a matter for interpretation. And then the final place where we have a definitive connection between Mary is, of course, when the folio is published in 1623. It's dedicated to her sons. There are suggestions that it's dedicated to their sons because of their longtime support for Shakespeare, although there's not much evidence of any direct support. William becomes Lord Chamberlain after William Shakespeare has returned to Stratford and not long before he dies. So it's not clear what their relationship to the guy from Stratford is, but of course, they do have a relationship with their mother, which goes back to pretty much their whole lives. There's this fascinating, and Ben Jonson is a close family friend. William Blount, the primary publisher, and Jaggard, who is the printer, are both the Sidney family printers and publisher. Blount publishes all of Mary's. Mary is still supervising the new editions of Philip's work, and she's doing that through Blount. William is using Blount and Jaggard as the official publishers for the Lord Chamberlain, who supervises printing and many other things for the crown. So there's this very interesting one last bit of information, which is in 1621, Mary hosts King James at her house at Houghton, which is 20 miles north of London. And after that, in July, and then immediately after that, she moves into a new home on the north side of London, directly across from the Jaggard print shop. And it's there in September where she dies of smallpox. And in the interim, it would appear that someone delivers to Ralph Crane, the scribe for the King's Men, fair copies of 7 unknown Shakespeare plays. And Ralph Crane prepares them as fair copies for printing. And the folio tells us that the whole folio, this collection of Shakespeare's plays, is going to be printed from new fair copies, newly edited and compiled. But although that's true for the first 5 plays that are printed, several of which have never been printed before, and some of which are not even known from records, it's not true for the rest of the folio. So Ralph Crane gets manuscripts for 5 plays. He writes them out. These new clean versions are presented to the printer. The printer prints those or starts to print those. Mary Sidney dies, and a few months later, the printing stops. And there's this period during most of 1622 where no further printing happens. The folio, there was a catalog that the folio was supposed to be available by the end of 1622. It's not, it doesn't get printed. It's not finished until a year later. And so there's this suggestive relationship between Mary Sidney's death, the interruption of the printing of the folio, and then its subsequent resumption, presumably under the sponsorship of her son William, at the direction of Ben Jonson. And Ben Jonson's encomium has a number of elements which have confused people for 400 years. The To my beloved, the writer William Shakespeare, the poem he writes is full of odd references that don't seem to make much sense. There's a first section which seems to warn people against misinterpreting or misattributing his praise, and warns that ignorant people will draw wrong conclusions. Then there is a reference to this Bass elegy to Shakespeare. Then there's the infamous line about how Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek. And And then there's a reference to nature's family to which Shakespeare belonged, which made them better than the ancient Greeks. There is, and my website offers a reading of this, which identifies all of these as references that are particular to Mary Sidney. So Samuel Daniel, remember him back in 1592, became her secretary, dedicated the Delia sonnets to her. One of those sonnets talks about it talks about her as Delia, who's thrown on Avon, the Avon River, which ran by her Wilton home and by Salisbury Cathedral, where she's buried, was the person to whom he gave all of his homage. He also wrote a poem about a monument nearby. So Wilton House is across the Avon River from Salisbury, and like all old Roman rivers and towns. The river is named Avon, and the town with the bridge crossing the river is named Stratford. In this case, Stratford sub Castle, because what we now know as the ruin of Old Sarum is on the hill above Stratford. But that's probably not the monument that that's not the monument Daniel is referring to. He's referring to a monument a couple miles uh, up north from the bridge, which we know as Stonehenge. And he wrote this lovely poem dedicated to the Sidneys, where he uses Stonehenge as this metaphor for how monuments to how marble monuments, stone monuments to men, um, uh, there was this speculation in period about why Stonehenge was built, who built it, and for whom. And so it is this mute monument, no longer testifying to the greatness of the men who created it or for whom it was created. And Daniel contrasts that with the immortality that's driven by poetry, exactly the metaphor that Johnson uses or Diggs uses for the Stratford Monument in the folio reference. So again, we have Mary is the one person who is present for where Shakespeare is supposed to be. We have all these references that seem to be tied not to anybody else, but specific to Mary and to literary works that reference Mary. And so the easiest explanation I can see is that Mary was Shakespeare, that for various reasons, William Herbert did not want that to become public. Henry Herbert, his father, did not want her to be publicly recognized to be a public author in the 1590s, and so forced her to sever her connections to the playing company and to publish under a pseudonym. That in the 1620s, William Herbert, also for his own political reasons, he's probably the most important politician in England, and is opposed to Charles and King Charles, King James, Prince Charles, and the Duke of Buckingham, who are all uh, conniving to marry Charles to the Spanish Infanta. And it just like Philip had to oppose the Alençon marriage in 1579, it was William Herbert who had to oppose the Spanish marriage of 1621. And it was not until the folio was actually published that that Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham, who had gone to Spain incognito to woo the princess, finally figured out that they were being jerked around and came back hot for war with Spain when William no longer had a concern about that. And there's also a scandal around his affair with his cousin, Mary Sidney Roth, which when presumably Mary Sidney was starting to publish the first folio, her niece Mary Sidney, who her married name was Roth. Mary Sidney wrote this long romance in the style of Arcadia, which was a roman à clef, a concealed, a barely altered story of her affair with William Herbert, and that came out in December of 21, just 2 months after Mary's death, and potentially could have caused a very untimely scandal for William. And so he had reasons to suppress the information that Mary was author of the Shakespeare works, particularly the Shakespeare sonnets, which are generally presumed to be family history and are widely thought to have been dedicated to William Herbert, connecting his mother to those sonnets and potentially inspiring people to dig through the sonnets to figure out, to find dirt on William would have been inconvenient. And then one
Absolutely.
last crowning bit of evidence here. The Stratford, remember the two bits of evidence that actually connect Stratford-on-Avon to William Shakespeare are this insertion on the will and this half-figure monument that people know, the Shakespeare monument, that's been described as a smug pork butcher. So the interesting thing about that monument is that it is now known to be the product of a stone cutter, a monument maker, by the name of Nicholas. Oh, am I going to lose his last name? Garrett and Nicholas. It'll come to me in a minute. The stonecutter who made that monument made another very similar monument, which was erected in 1618 for the Count and Countess of Rutland. The Countess of Rutland was Elizabeth Sidney, Philip Sidney's only daughter. The Count and Countess of Rutland did not have surviving children, so the Earl of Rutland, the earldom passed to his brother, and they had this is the Manners family. They had he had an awkward relationship with over money with Elizabeth before she died, and then it seems unlikely that he would have spent the money for this elaborate tomb. So the most likely person to have constructed it was William Herbert. So we can connect William Herbert with the stonemason who provided the Shakespeare monument. And if he wanted to divert attention from his mother, identified as the author in the book, he was in an obvious position to have somebody insert a line in the will and place this monument. So
Yeah.
that's most of the evidence for Mary Sidney. There's a lot of literary evidence. There's a lot of biographical evidence, which fleshes out that story and tells the story of her life. But it is certainly the best documented story or the relationship between anyone and this author, William Shakespeare, and the people we know were associated with him during the period he was writing plays.
That's an amazing, like, so when we first asked the question, it began as this like almost history lesson, right? And it's like, all right, where's this guy going with this history lesson? This is all neat and stuff. I saw Wolf Hall. I watched the Tudors. What's he getting at? And it's like, but as you go through what is literally the most important history of England, it ends up completely informing Philip and Mary Sidney's life, upbringing, and worldviews, and such that it informs their literature. And you end up seeing that this informs a lot of the theatrical literature of the 1590s, a lot of the poetic literature of the 1590s, um, of which Shakespeare's maybe the biggest prime example, but we're not limited to Shakespeare. Wanted to bring up a few moments. You're pitching Marlowe as, working for Mary Sidney in these kind of prime Marlowe moments. Um, Marlowe's last play is supposed to be Massacre at Paris. Who else would have known about that other than Mary having her brother's firsthand accounts, right? Um,
Well,
uh,
so there is some reason to think that Marlowe was working for Walsingham until Walsingham's death in 1591. Walsingham was present with her brother there. So I'm hesitant to make the only this person could have known
right,
this
right.
thing because they were present, because so many people at the court had the relevant experience that once you move move Shakespeare into this very intimate circle of court writers. Once you put him in the Mary Sidney circle, then questions like how could he have known about the law? Mary Sidney had was friends with Francis Bacon and with John Dee and with her son William was a member of Gray's Inn, and so all of these people, you in the Elizabethan period, you don't do 6 degrees of separation. 6 degrees of separation connect anyone in England. It's pretty much 2 degrees of separation connect everyone in the court. And so she either directly knew people who definitely were there, or but she could just be the conduit for that. So I'm hesitant to announce that this is definitely Mary Sidney. And I really dislike these sorts of arguments that say, if you know that Shakespeare was Mary Sidney or Oxford or Thomas North or anybody else, that allows you to interpret all this evidence in a unique way that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't know this thing. I think the evidence for Mary does not require her to be Shakespeare. If you are determined that Shakespeare was an actor from Stratford, Mary answers a lot of those questions. How was he connected to the court? How was he connected to the players? How was he connected to other writers? How did he learn all these things? Where did he get these concerns? All of these things emerge from the connection to Mary without necessarily requiring that she be the author. It's just that if you have somebody who is objectively one of the 5 greatest authors writing in the period, who is the one person who is attached to the works of Shakespeare, it's much easier to just go with that explanation than to drag some poor schmuck from Stratford-on-Avon who's busily making a market in black market wool and stuff him into this story where somehow he managed to glide through 25 years of being a famous actor that nobody recorded seeing on stage, that was never recorded as being part of a playing company other than as William Shakespeare, unidentified otherwise, member of the Lord Chamberlain's men. It's just they're and people want to make him a play broker. Um, but there's no record of him buying and selling any plays. These are very public occupations, being an actor, being a broker who's buying and selling plays to printers and to playing companies, and presumably corresponding with writers in this process. It's hard to imagine that didn't leave a record. It's much easier to believe that there was no connection and it was manufactured with the simple with, with, with the simple expedient of having somebody go up to Stratford, get a copy of the will, write this bequest in between the lines, and then sending up this figural monument, which appears to have been purchased secondhand, to provide a visual anchor for people who go to Stratford looking for the writer.
Okay, and like all that adds up. Just all that adds up. One, I want to just maybe point to a few more theatrical connections with this history. It's not just Massacre at Paris. We talked at length about Lady Jane Grey, or the 9 Days Queen. That's dramatized in Dekker and Webster's Lady Jane Grey, which I guess we now know is Sir Thomas Wyatt. Where I guess we got two plays, Lady Jane Grey Part 1 and Part 2, smushed together, maybe even with the third play's stuff kind of smushed together. But that's totally surrounding that. And it's like John Webster has pieces dedicated to Mary Sidney. And so, I don't have as much evidence to show that John Webster's living in the house like Samuel Daniel was, but we have connections to show that, okay, John Webster thinks pretty highly of Philip for sure, and he dedicates stuff to Mary, and he's one of the few people to talk about Shakespeare. We've done videos about how darn similar he gets to Shakespeare, and at some point he's here writing material about the Sidney family and dedicating works to Mary Sidney.
Yeah, Mary has been proposed as the model for the Duchess of Malfi. So
Right.
we the big picture is that Mary, as a noblewoman, is at the center of this story from before her birth, when Edward VI dies in her father's arms, through to the moment where she dies across the street from the printing house, printing the folio. Um, she's connected. So not only is she in the political story, she's in the physical story of the playwrights and the players and the productions. When James visits Wilton in 1603. She apparently arranges for All's Well, or for As You Like It, to be performed there, the only actually recorded instance of it being played in period. So she's at the center of this theatrical scene, the first patron of the company, the one place where we have documentary evidence to say the author was there, again involved in the printing process, and then we have all of these literary references from people who seem to know, who and nobody comes out. Well, I take that back. So Gabriel Harvey in 1593 in the Supererogation of Pierce Penniless describes Mary as his gentleman patroness and strongly implies that she is about to publish her Venus and Adonis, written in a letter which is dated between the time it was anonymously registered and the time it was actually printed a few weeks later. So there is one actual reasonably clear. She's not identified by name as the gentlewoman patroness, but she is clearly enough identified that it is the scholarly consensus that it is she, and there's many reasons to think that it is she. But then other early references, William Covell in Parliamentia, there's a marginal reference to Shakespeare, which is attached to a text about Samuel Daniels Delia, who is Mary Sidney, and which specifically references Mary Sidney as the author of Antony and as the great writer who was as Sappho was victorious in her battles with other writers. We have, and as I said, the first folio references, which have so confused people for so many years, all seem to match to literary references from Daniel and Drayton and Marlowe and others to Mary Sidney. So you can just take clips of sort of Mary Sidney's best notices and paste them together and recover Johnson's encomium, which, you know, it
Yeah,
suggests
yeah,
something.
that it's a lot. Let me see. I had maybe one or two more thoughts, and then we can. I'll turn over to Brady. Let me see. Actually, I guess I'll just turn over to Brady. Did you have any lingering questions or thoughts, Brady? I know you'd come up with a whole list of stuff. Um, I guess one thing I did want to bring up is that we're supposed to be group theorists, and while we're group theorists, I do feel like I have to pitch names that I think are within that group harder than maybe other names just because they're not being said. And so we've come out and pitched Philip Sidney pretty hard as like at least a big time influence on Shakespeare. But we've been pitching other names. I brought up Webster earlier. Decker's a big one here. And I guess I just want to say that I think Mary Sidney, more than any popular kits, Oxford or Bacon or Marlowe, Mary Sidney allows and accommodates for group theory, I think, better than anybody. I'm not necessarily saying it has to be group theory, but the fact that she is constantly acknowledged is working with other people, is being sort of this head of a circle. That is what Sappho was in ancient Greece. She's not just a great poet, she was the head of a circle of great poets. And I think that there may be references beyond the Sappho thing. You and I have talked about the lines in the end of Virga Demiarum by Joseph Hall, where he's talking about Labio, but then goes into all the things that Labio does, and then he goes into the muse poetry itself, and that she has the muse, she has her tasked herd of shepherds continuing the legacy of basically Philip Sidney. And it's like, well, maybe he's just talking about poets in general happen to be doing that, but that sounds distinctively like this Mary Sidney project, and using this female pronoun her kind of suggestive, and the shepherds being part of this pastoral scene that Spencer into Daniel into Drayton, all those guys ring very Sidneyan to me. So I don't know. I think that there's maybe a lot more out there that we can start to dig up and uncover and say, okay, what does this mean? Once we kind of come up with some meaning, say, how does it relate? And I don't want to say we should go search for Mary Sidney stuff, because that's a path that gets a little dangerous and slippery slope. But I think that as we do look for deeper stuff, it won't be surprising to find that a lot of it has Mary Sidney readings and informs this further. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to pitch
I
anybody
think
that's
that's
interested.
fair. I think,
Mary Sidney's a really
as I said, I
yeah.
think
Continue.
Mary is I think Mary is the best way to resolve the questions about Stratford. So if you insist on Stratford, you can do a group theory in which Stratford is the primary author and Mary is the conduit to all the other resources and writers that contribute. Obviously, you can reformulate that. So, if Marlowe is working for her in 1592 and 1593 and fakes his death, well, then she can be the conduit for Marlowe to continue to write and for his works to be integrated or even to exchange through her with the various other writers who were associated with her and associated with her players and later with her children. So there are many ways to, if you're not determined to be parsimonious, to take the simplest reading of the direct evidence, there are ways to reconstitute a group of writers or any of a number of writers whose work could, through Mary Sidney, be reaching the players and reaching the publishers. And so she functions reasonably well as a clearinghouse. But again, this question that just keeps coming up is if you're trying to patch together some story because you don't have an author, and the one person that you can attach to this story just happens to be arguably the best writer in the period, it seems like you're just going, well, it can't be a woman, it can't be a countess, so we're just going to set her aside and say, who can we drag into this story without a whole lot of evidence? But there are people you can drag into this story without a whole lot of evidence and with plausible explanations for why that evidence doesn't exist, right? Marlowe has faked his death and is pretending to be dead somewhere. And so you don't expect to see a lot of documentary evidence about his life after death. So yeah, there are ways, and I have a lot of friends who are attached to various other authorship candidates, and we've been talking about, and many of them are very argumentative. They want to make their argument to me, and they want me to stand up for my argument to them. And I really don't think that this is a question which is much advanced by trying to make the best possible argument out of the existing evidence. I think I found a lot of evidence in the last 5 years which ties Mary into this story. And I'm sure that there is relevant evidence about other potential writers or other known writers or potential writers, other noblemen. There's stuff we don't know about Oxford and his family and his playing companies. There's stuff we don't know about Ferdinando Stanley. We don't know about Roger Manners and Elizabeth Sidney. There are many people who are part of this story whose stories have been excluded from the orthodox story of Shakespeare because they're determined. They're locked onto it's the Stratford man, and he was a natural genius who wasn't part of the court, wasn't really connected to the literary scene. And there's a lot of evidence that there are major problems with that story, and part of keeping that story together, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, was to exclude a lot of these other players from being brought into that story. And so there's a lot of stuff which I don't know, which I want other people to find. And so I'm definitely not interested in convincing the Marlowe people and the Oxford people to stop researching their candidate, because I don't want to have to do the research on their candidate to figure how those people fit into Mary's story if there are people who are in love with them who can be hoodwinked into doing that research for me. And so I think there is a value in all these different viewpoints, as long as the focus of that work, the primary focus of that work, is to surface documentary materials that might be relevant, that helps us to understand the players, the plays, the writers, the playhouses, the court relationship and governance of all of the above, which eventually are the documentary pieces which will solve this puzzle. I have a solution. I think it's a compelling solution given the evidence I have available to me. I think I am reasonably well up on the evidence that other people have brought to the table, but I'm not satisfied with the evidence about all these other participants in this environment. And if I have a choice between persuading them to support Mary based on the evidence I've surfaced and to go dig up some useful evidence about their man, I'd much rather see the latter. And we can argue it out later and eventually we'll get it right. But there's just so much real work to do chasing down these bits. And you know, there are Oxfordians I think are really confused about some basic issues that I also think have done some really good work surfacing the documentary materials, surfacing source materials, thinking of just one recent Earl Showerman's work on Shakespeare's use of Greek tragedy. I think that stuff's great. I don't really see how it supports Oxford's candidacy. And I think the efforts to make it support Oxford's candidacy are the weakest parts of it. But I think there really is a lot of Greek tragedy in Shakespeare. And I think we understand Shakespeare better if we understand how he borrows from the Greek theatrical tradition and specific Greek works. And eventually, I hope we get to understanding identifying which specific works, probably in Latin, that he had access to that informed the way that he dealt with these plays. So much of our sourcing of Shakespeare is based on this notion that the author couldn't read Greek or Latin and had very limited access to any language except English, and so everything has to be funneled through some English translation or English retelling that Shakespeare might have encountered. And if nothing else, I'm very confident that the evidence I've turned up strongly suggests an author, whoever it is, who through Mary or on their own accord in the circle of Mary has much deeper resources for getting hold of and understanding these source materials in a multitude of languages. And so again, I think there's the field has been constrained by people determined to focus attention and to drive their interpretations based on a biographical reading. I think to the tremendous disservice of actually getting all of the evidence we need and doing real readings of the Shakespeare, the printed Shakespeare materials against the contextual materials that I think Shakespeare actually used, and having if the authorship question has opened up a lot of those discussions, and frankly, Orthodox scholarship has revisited a lot of those conclusions and said, you know, there's real evidence for Shakespeare engaging with these works in Greek tragedies or these works in the French Senecan plays through Garnier or whatever. The fact that now all of that seems to be more acceptable, and the idea that Shakespeare, that the canonical works might be multi-authored and that those people are bringing different perspectives, it would be a real tragedy if I solved this problem by writing a popular book that convinced everybody that it was Mary Sidney and stopped all of this really interesting research into where these plays are emerging from. Um, and so that's kind of where I'm at is, you know, I would like to, I think Mary certainly deserves to be better, more widely read for her own works. I think that it is helpful to have the Mary Sidney perspective, a woman who has an extraordinary connection to the politics of this period and to the literature of this period, and apparently a real interest in these sort of deeper questions that I think she's answering. So I think Mary as Shakespeare helps us because it directs us to much richer readings of Shakespeare, because there's sort of nothing that is beyond the interest or capability of Mary to drag into these works. And if we accept that Shakespeare, whoever it is, had the capabilities of Mary Sidney, I think we would get much further in getting the value out of reading the works.
That's unbelievably well stated. Love how careful you've been about stating all your claims here tonight. It's that kind of care and attention to detail that I think is it's not used enough in this whole scene. Because at some point, I know people like, oh, you're being too nitty gritty. You're splitting hairs here, but those little attentions to detail, like that's the difference between using a good methodology and using a bunk methodology. I mean, it really is. Like you're saying, simple stuff like understanding inference value. It seems nitty gritty, but it's a real important thing. Um, just want to show folks this is what happens every time we do book club. I have notes and notes and notes and notes and notes from David talking. So if you're wondering, like that, I'm not nodding off. I'm looking down at my pen pad because yeah, David's always dropping treasure for us. And you know, Brady and I are super interested, and I'll speak for myself here. Let Brady speak for himself, but super interested in Mary Sidney. Every day growing more and more convinced that David is really, really onto something here. But I think, like David, I don't want to sit here and say you have to believe Mary Sidney is 100% Shakespeare or something like that. That's never been our pitch. Is David saying, like, let's not put the cart before the horse here. We're trying to do all this to understand Shakespeare. We're not understanding Shakespeare to get to the true author. We're trying to find the true author to understand Shakespeare. And you know, at some point, yeah, it all mixes together, but definitely not put the cart before the horse and say that the most important point is the name of the author. Like that's not the most important point. It's understanding the text, understanding the era, and that at the end of the day, if we do all that correctly, we get to the, you know, the author's name, but that's not the end all be all goal. David, this has been fantastic. Maybe in the future we can come back and get nitty gritty with certain texts or certain ideas and do some more Mary talk. Otherwise, this has been fantastic. I'll turn it over to Brady now. Thanks guys for tuning in. Brady.
Yeah, luckily I think he covered all my questions at the end because I was gonna ask about any other candidates to consider, like what methodologies do you think we need to take it, but no, he pretty much tied it off into a bow for us. And we're already approaching over the 2 hour mark here, and so I think that this was like, dude, you just got like a whole Elizabethan Renaissance history lecture in 2 hours, right? So he just seamlessly tied in like all of Shakespeare and pre-Sidney history all the way to modern Broadway for all as far as we're concerned, right? So I thought it was a great summation, a great pitch, and kind of a good. I've been using that word primer, right, for just kind of getting you up to speed for where David's at with his sort of research. But before we sign off, David, you want to drop where you're writing these days? What's the name of your website specifically, and where maybe people want to catch you?
My website is hosted on Substack, and you can find it either under the URL, which is www.marywasshakespeare, or you can find it under the name of the Substack, which is Mary Sidney Shakespeare Spear Shaker, Shakespeare in the Sidney Circle. So you should be able to find it both ways, and I can give you a link that you can drop in the comments or in the
Info, yeah.
yeah,
Description
the
box.
description
Yep.
that will hook people up. And I welcome people to come and offer comments and criticism. I can't possibly afford people to actually find all my errors. So if you want to come prove me wrong, I would deeply appreciate your efforts. So that's great. This was a fun talk. I know I rambled a little bit, and if you guys, if we're done,
We call it
you guys can,
pontificating, not rambling.
if
No.
you guys can, if you want to cut out some chunks in the middle.
I won't censor you. No, never.
Yeah, Brady editing. He always
This
makes
is more a
sure.
conversation and less me going on for an hour about the Mary Sidney story. I kind of got started and I thought I had a plan about where I was going, and it just sort of, kept rolling along. There were a couple more key things that I thought I should share, and it did occur to me that when I started, I had a relatively manageable version in mind, and as it rolled out, it sort of rolled out quite a bit longer than I had intended. So, like I said, if you guys want to, clip some stuff and save it for video too, that's okay too.
It was all great, David. I guess one last thing before we sign you off, I do want to remind folks that David Richardson here will be debating Dennis McCarthy, the champion of Thomas North, and they will be debating over the upstart crow and what the correct identity of that reference in Green's Groatsworth's wit is. And obviously, we're sort of siding with David here. Hopefully, that debate can be elucidating and enlightening, and isn't just mine, no mine, no mine. And I know with you, it never is that. And I'll leave it to Dennis to prove to me that he's also interested in getting further with this and not just proving a stance, but if he can prove his stance strongly enough, maybe there's some nuggets of truth in what he's pitching too. But I just want everybody to be aware of this. I don't know exactly how to people are going
So
to be able to.
I'll get you the link, and you should probably clarify that the combatants here will be. I will be advocating for Ned Allen, the actor of The Admiral's Men, and he will be advocating for the traditional identification of the crow with William Shakespeare. And although he thinks that North is the primary original author of the plays, he does credit this William Shakespeare from Stratford as the author of the most of the printed plays which we have received. So uh, those will be the views competing in this debate.
Okay. Well, stay tuned, folks. It'll be the Rumble in the Jungle Part 3. Can't wait for it to go down. Brady, I guess you can sign us off here. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Hope to come at y'all soon with some more stuff. Loved Brady's little pop-in live stream last night. Also want to give that a shout out. But yeah, sign us out, Brady.
All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Check out all the links down below in the description. And as always, Nullius in Verba.